He's primarily known in the United States among members of my generation as the Minister of Magic Cornelius Fudge from the Harry Potter movies. Robert Hardy has had a long and varied career on the stages and screens of England. Known for playing Sir Winston Churchill in 5 different films, he has the distinction of playing both Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt on various occasions. A scholar and respected authority on the medieval longbow, Mr. Hardy has authored 2 books on the subject. He was one of the experts consulted about the longbows found when the Mary Rose, a warship of the English Tudor Navy of King Henry VIII, was salvaged. During his time at Magdalen College in Oxford, he studied under both C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, earning a BA in English with honors. In the BBC adaptation of James Herriot's All Creatures Great and Small, Mr. Hardy played the role of Siegfried Farnon, who and has probably performed in more Shakespeare plays than you can name. Please join me in welcoming Robert Hardy back to Hillsdale College.
I can't tell you what a joy it is to be back at Hillsdale. I had an absolutely wonderful week here in October last year when we were talking about nobody but Churchill, which is why I came. And so tonight I don't really know what to say at all because I haven't been commissioned. So I've got so much to say that I don't know how long you're going to be here. But to mitigate the dangers that are inherent in not knowing what you're at, I've brought a large timepiece which I can actually read. I mean, it's large enough for me to read. And I won't go on too long. I'll see how many people fall asleep and how the doors are being used and so on. But I've got various things that I'm absolutely determined to tell you about. I think if I had any commission at all from those in authority about tonight, it was that I was to talk about the theatre. Well, I don't know much about the theatre, really, because I'm something of an amateur. I went to no acting school, as many of my charming colleagues are too apt to say. But I'm going to start with a word or two about my ties with your great country, America. One of my great-great-great-grandfathers, of course, by the time you get to 3 greats, you've acquired quite a number, haven't you, because it's doubled up every time. And my particular grandfather was a man who was born and died in the little town of Kittery in Maine. And he was, in the official documents, which I'm going to wave about from time to time because I don't want to get off the line, he was known in his lifetime as the hero of Louisburg, because he led an army which he'd raised himself in Maine and Massachusetts, a number of some, let me tell you, 4,200 militia, sailors and marines with 90 ships and vessels which were provided by, what are they called, the English, who stood off in their old-fashioned way, waiting for action to happen. But he marched up, ensconced himself on a ridge, and was responsible for taking Louisburg in 1745 from the French, who were cross about it. But nevertheless, they had to surrender. They got it back on a sort of loan. This was during the War of the Austrian Succession, which I'm sure you all know all about, a good deal more than me, probably. But he was, William Pepperell was of Anglo-Welsh descent, and there'd been two Pepperells before him in Kittery, and they were unenterprisingly called the same as him, William Pepperell. And there'll be another one who comes in a moment. But this particular William was a very successful American dream gent. I mean, as mercantile developer and as shipbuilder and goodness knows what all, he did do extremely well, and he invested in masses of land, of which he held, with his wife, vast areas. He had a son who died young, and then he was succeeded by his grandson, whose name was Sparrock, spelled Sparhawk, also from Kittery. But he had, in order to inherit not only all the land and the wealth, but the title which he'd be, William, the successor, had earned from the King of England. And this grandson became Sir William Pepperell, a baronet, and he was what's the word, not mayor, something much grander than mayor. He was the governor of both Maine and Massachusetts, because they were together at that time. And he was, of course, running into trouble because there was that odd occurrence called the Revolution. And he was sent packing. But George, it was George III by this time, because his grandfather had been dealing with George II. George III was so touched by his loyalty. I mean, we call him in the family, we call him the last loyalist governor of Maine and Massachusetts. I don't think you'd go with the loyalist adjective, but back he came to England, and eventually I inherited a very beautiful embroidered waistcoat that he used to wear when he was living with the king at Windsor Castle for a while, until he found somewhere to live, borrowing money, I think, from anybody in sight, because he had nothing left from America. And I nearly brought it because I thought you'd be intrigued to see it, but then my courage deserted me, and I thought if my suitcase gets torn open or ruined in the journey or unpacking or something, it would be too sad to lose this heirloom, so I'm afraid I have no waistcoat except for this rather boring grey number. But it really is very beautiful and in very good order, and I'm very proud and happy to have it. Now, quite enough about him. Other American links that I have is that I played, years and years ago, I played Hamlet by William Shakespeare and Henry V by William Shakespeare on alternate nights right through the summer festival at Ravinia outside Chicago, and I had a most ravishing time, which brings me to some of my other links, because I was put to stay with the most wonderful family. James Douglas, who was Eisenhower's Minister for Air, and they were a wonderful, wonderful, generous, kind lot. And this is, every time I come to America, I am astonished. I must cease being astonished, but at Hillsdale, when I came in October last to talk about Churchill, I was absolutely staggered by the courtesy, by the elegant manners, and the tolerance of an invading Englishman that I met It was enchanting, and I'm finding the same again, although, of course, it not being a thing dedicated to any particular, I mean, you're all far too busy learning. The most that Hillsdale can teach you, which I should think is a very great deal, and more than probably anywhere else that I've ever been or heard of, although I was very lucky at Oxford to be, as you were told, to be tutored by C.S. Lewis. I don't know whether that's a name that means anything to you, but he was a most lovely man. I think in Hillsdale it does mean a great deal to you. And J.R.R. Tolkien, which I know means something to you, who taught Anglo-Saxon, Rael min swigeth an ich rusan treda, Other var vi gebuga, other var du drefa. Hier Ludwig kan mjörtsne König, mit his fief Jarlman, man afslag mit him. That's how he taught me, quite believably, to speak Anglo-Saxon. And of course, he also taught us all, who came to him, how to do Chaucer. Do you do Chaucer, any of you? It's a lovely sound, I think. A little bit of French, a little bit of English, a little bit of this, that, and the other. Juan Nataprila, with his shore soldier, the drocht of Merch, hath Per said to the rotor. And every, oh no, I've tried. Then longen folk to go on pilgrimage, from every sheer of England to Canterbury I went, the holy blissful martyr for to seek, who hem hath holpen when that they were awake. Well, obviously I'm not very good at it now. I do tend to forget. We had lately, last week indeed, your great Obama over. He came to congratulate the Queen on being 90. He forgot to congratulate me on being 6 months older than the Queen. But I forgave him. And he was very urbane and charming, and told us all that the most important thing to America and to him was the special relationship. And I don't know whether anybody told you, I entitled this chat to you as 2 lives and 2 ships. But actually there's a third ship, the international fellowship between your great country and mine. Long may it last. But as soon as that charm had gone past his lips, he started lecturing us on what we were to do about Europe and which way we were to vote in the referendum. But so he got whacked a bit for that in the English press. And then I suppose there's one other. I met there a wonderful family who had derived from a general, I think, in the Civil War, your Civil War, Penniman, the Penniman family. And I'd hoped that they might reach up here, but I don't think they've been able to, because I became really, really close friends of theirs and have remained so. So there's another link. And I suppose the last link that's worth mentioning is that when I was filming Churchill, parts of the wilderness years, and we were spending a week or 2 in Monument Valley, standing in for, instead of going to Hollywood, which Churchill did visit several times and met everybody there. But we decided Monument Valley would be more fun, and we met Indians and all sorts there. And I had a pair of, I had a false tooth plate, which I'd had made up on the advice of a dentist who was taught by Churchill's own dentist, because I wanted something like Churchill had to fight against, instead of his very thick essays, which he had to overcome. You know, he was told when he was young, and his parents sent him to an expert in straight speaking. The man spent several days, I think, trying to get him to speak straight, like an ordinary human. and failed completely, and said, no, you'll be all right, you'll do perfectly well. Just a warning, don't engage in anything which includes public speaking. You won't, will you? But he did. But these teeth I'm not sure it was a good idea, because it made it really very hard to do some of the time. And when we were in Monument Valley, we were given lunch, from the commissary. And I had to I had to take these things out and put them on the side, and I put them on the side of a table. And a wild dog, of which, he wasn't going to eat us, but he did eat my teeth. And went off with them, and that was the last I saw of them, so I had to invent the sound that had been induced by this cleverly conceived plate. Myself, I had to do it without help. Now, the next thing, I suppose, there was for some years a wild dog with a lisp in Monument Valley, but I don't know. I never met him again, because I was very cross with him. The next thing that I simply must talk about, because I was told I was to, is about acting. I don't know how many of you, or if any of you, are concerned with the acting fraternity here, which I believe is wonderful. But acting is an extraordinary pastime, and when asked by people that come up to the elderly like me, and they say, what do we do to be saved? We want to be an actor, we want to be an actress. My answer is always, don't! Pray, think of something sensible. But I will tell you what I think about acting. In short order, I keep looking at my watch. I think we're okay for the moment. Anybody asleep? You're very kind-hearted. You see, that's what I call good manners. I think it's absolutely wonderful. If you are determined to become actors, my saying don't will not have the least effect upon you, because one of the things you've got to have is total determination. You have also to be, in my opinion, slightly what we call in England round the bend, off the trolley, mad. There should be a touch of madness in you. You've got somebody vying to be president at the moment who I think has the right sort of attitude. But what else do you need? Obviously you need talent. And talent is what does so much harm at, if I may say so, your stage, when you are doing wonderfully at a place like Hillsdale, or Oxford, or Cambridge, or Harvard, or whatever. I must just say in brackets that I'm so impressed with what Hillsdale College offers that I rather wish I'd come here and not been at Oxford. But then I would have missed those two starlit people who did teach me. The other things you need are a spine of steel and enormous, undaunted patience, which you will really need, because it's not an easy profession. It was very easy when I joined it, because I joined it having served the king, as we say. And indeed, that's one other thing that always reminds me of America, is remembering that I was taught to fly for the Royal Air Force England, Britain, in Texas, which was heaven, because they had butter, milk, sugar, everything that we hadn't had for quite a long time. And wonderful people I met there, too. The man who called himself the dispatcher, who really, he used to call our airplanes ships. And he used to say, Hardy, your ship 4, over there, don't let it frighten you. And then one day it leaked out that he was up all night farming. And I was so lost in admiration at this kindly, gentle man who said, don't be afraid. He then went home in the evening and started working on his farm, which he did, as far as I can make out, for most of the night. He's one of the few men I've totally admired. Forgive me. I'm told that Hillsdale is one of the worst places for that particular kind of cough. It's in the spring particularly. But yeah, patience. You will need patience. It was so easy when I joined the forces of acting, because there was, of course, sadly, an enormous trough, a great trench of those who never came back, and of those who came back and were unable to follow what they wanted to follow, and those who simply had changed their minds. So they were on the lookout, and this is one of the things that I'd guessed, which is why I went back to my university, where I'd already been, thinking there would be this enormous gap to be filled with younger people. And so it worked out, so that I took my finals, as some of you are going to do this coming weekend, I think, and for which I wish you every sort of luck. My heart will be with you. Awful time, but exciting too, and a chance to look ahead at what's coming. And I was able, having done my finals in November of whatever year it was, let's not go into that. I was able to start rehearsing at Stratford, Shakespeare's Stratford-on-Avon, in January of the following year. And that is easy, because it doesn't often happen like that. There are dangers, other dangers too, in following the acting trade. One of which is, of course, you are your only equipment. And it does make you terribly self-centered, quite rightly. But somehow you have to correct that gently. Work on not being totally self-centered, and try and make the center of your focus the next part you're going to play. That, for me, has always been the exciting thing. That's why I'm that kind. Of course, there are at least two main kinds of actor. One is the actor who is always himself. I mean, it's jolly nice for us all who watch him or her, because we can always say, oh, yeah, hello, there they are, doing it exactly the same in a quite different part. And there are those of us who try to get behind the character we play. That's why I've always loved being offered parts of people who really have lived, because there is a body of evidence to dig about, to find out about, to try and get yourself in sympathy with, to understand, and to try and become, which is what I tried to do with Winston Churchill for ages and ages. Whether I've succeeded or not, I don't know, probably not. But I've seen the result of some of my efforts, and just occasionally there's a glimmer of what he was, this extraordinary man. By the way, I suppose you all know that your president here, Dr. Ahn, has written the best book about Winston Churchill, called Churchill's Trial. If you haven't got it, I beg you to get it. I've had in my library up until October last, well over 100 books by various people, some good, some medium, some not good, on Winston Churchill. I mean, people never stop writing about him. And quite the best, the most understanding, the most truly philosophical understanding of Churchill, the character, is by your president, Dr. Ahn, who first invited me to come here in October. I beg you to read it. It is an absolute work of art. and a work of complete understanding. It's a joy. I've read it twice, and I can't wait to get back home and start it again and try and read it from a different perspective. So back to this danger of being your only equipment as an actor and therefore concentrating on yourself. You have somehow to adjust the mechanics of that situation yourself. Very few people are going to help you. There are some people who can help. Some directors are very good at it. Some people in other branches of theatre or filmmaking. And that's why I became an actor, because of film, because I was of that generation who had their whole upbringing in acting from film. Very different sort of film in those days from what we watch now. I watched on the plane The Revenant. Have you seen it? It's a shaker, isn't it? And the plane started shaking. It was so frightened. I thought it was wonderful. And they were trying to serve dinner at the same time, so I missed a whole bit in the middle. I thought, never mind, I'll see it on the big screen. It'll be great. And then after about 5 minutes thinking, I thought, I don't think I can face this film on a big screen. All that bear mauling and stuff and cruelty. God, it's an extraordinary film, brilliantly made, brilliantly lit, brilliantly acting, but I'm not sure I could face it again. So you'll have to try and get over that employment and focus upon yourself, because like everybody else in the world, you won't in fact be the most important person, except for that extraordinary moment when you stride out onto the stage and you become somebody else, unless you're one of that other kind of actor who we all recognize and say, oh, thank goodness, we know who he or she is. Such a relief. But you will overcome it, because then you can enjoy yourselves and enjoy the business. If you're my kind of actor, trying to get inside somebody, then you can really enjoy all that part of it, the research. It's the research. When I was playing Churchill for the first time in an 8-hour epic, we broke for a fortnight over Christmas. And my director, wonderful man, alas now dead, said to me, don't you dare lose Winston over the holiday. And my family I was so terrified of losing what little I'd achieved of Winston, that my family complained raucously over the whole Christmas period. Oh, why did you have to bring that ghastly man into the house? Oh, heaven's sake, stop. So I did stop. I just engineered stopping and did stop. And when we went back to film at Chartwell, the Churchill house, where we'd been for weeks, destroying the place, the director said, cut, cut, cut. Let's go for a walk. And he said to me, what's happened to Mr. Churchill over Christmas? And I said, oh dear, have I lost him? Well, quite a lot, yes. You better have a think. Take half an hour off. And I had to think my way back in to this kind of Churchill which I did, which was an effort to not copy, but evoke him. And he kept saying to me, I'm going to make a short assembly, a sort of hour assembly when we've got enough stuff. And you ought to come and see it. And I said, no, I never will. No, I won't. No, I won't. But eventually he said, right, you're coming tonight. Caught me unawares. And I said, no, I can't. I really can't see myself. I'll just lose all confidence that I have. He said, you are to come. I beg you to come. And I order you to come. And I said, will you give me a bottle of whiskey now? And he said, of course. I'll give you 3. So, armed with 2 bottles of whiskey, I sat through it. And I realized that what I thought I'd got right, which was his voice, I hadn't. What I had got quite right was some of the physical aspects, but what I was eventually relieved about was that I had not copied him so much as found a way to evoke him, which brought him into people's minds, so that people watching actually began after a bit to think they were watching him. And that gradually came back to me when the whole 8 hours was complete and done, and pleased me very greatly. So, I think that's probably enough about acting, isn't it? Except I'll tell you that when I was, and all of us of my age who were filling this tragic valley of the dead, we were dominated by 3 great actors of our period, or previous to our period. Laurence Olivier, who you may have heard of, John Gielgud, who you may not have heard of, Ralph Richardson, I think the greatest of the 3 who you might have heard of. And we spent our time, some consciously, some unconsciously, imitating them in turn. I was best at Ralph Richardson because I thought he was the best. I thought him the best actor of all, ever. And at a time when I was really quite famous, years and years ago, I saw him across the room at a reception in London, and I went and knelt at his feet and said, "Sir Ralph, I've always been a total admirer of yours. I think you're the greatest actor Britain has ever produced." And he said, "Oh, how kind, how very kind." And I was really quite famous at this time. He said, "That's kind. I'm glad you said that. And who are you?" Put me in my place. I think probably I'm going to the last injunction that I have about being an actor or an actress. And that is find something else to accompany your life as an actor. There will be gaps. There will be terrible, heart-rending times when nobody rings you up, when nobody says, "Oh, I've been admiring you for years. I want you so much in my next film," or "Here's a wonderful play. Will you join me?" There will be bad times. And that's when you need the patience, which I underlined a moment ago. And you must choose what you want to be your alternative life. I was spoilt. I was just so lucky, because at the age of 5 or 6, I found in my father's attic, I wandered about a great deal, I found 2 longbows. You know what they are? Sure you do. And I took them gingerly downstairs to the grown-ups to say, "What are these and why?" And I suppose it was my father who said, "Oh, yes, I remember those. Those are 18th century family longbows. I wouldn't try and do anything with them. They're dry as dust because they've been in hot attics." So by the time I was 8, I'd broken both of them. But it had engendered an extraordinary sort of fascination, this simple, rather exquisite curve. And I began to want to study the history of the longbow, which I did and still do. I'm now guilty of 2 major books. One, I've brought a copy of one of the last copies, because they're both out of print, as a present for Dr. Arne, in return for his present to me in October. And the other one, which I'd love to have brought and put in the Hillsdale Library, which I did with a proper professor of medieval history. It's called The Great Warbow, and it's the whole history of the longbow in use in war, in armies, from its very beginning, right through the year of Hastings, when poor Harold of England, if you remember, was hit in the eye and lost the Battle of Hastings to William the Bastard of Normandy. But it's a hugely heavy, thick book, and I think wouldn't have got onto the aeroplane without danger. So I'm going to tell anybody who wants to know about it what it's called, and where you may be able to buy a very expensive copy of it, but that's the result of years and years of study. And the study started at a symposium rather like the Churchill Symposium here at Hillsdale last October, but at a university called Reading in England, where I came across two people again who I had been working with on the physical development of the longbow through the ages. And there they were, and curiously enough, a great many people there. And the tenor, the feel of the conference was that our ancestors who preceded us really were thick as two bricks, dragged their knuckles on the ground and knew nothing about anything. And these two professors from the Imperial College of Science and I, who had been working together, were the only three who stood up and said, "You are talking nonsense. We have forgotten so much of what they knew and what they learnt that we should be ashamed of ourselves." And we talked separately on that line of questioning. So we went back rejuvenated to our work on the history of military archery, which was our subject, and what was the strength of these bows, how were they handled, how were they deployed, and came up with all sorts of interesting facts. And the further we got into the subject, the more we couldn't believe what we were discovering. I don't know whether any of you are archers, but the average weight of a bow nowadays, modern or ancient, longbow or modern engineered, brilliantly engineered modern bows that have their place in the Olympics, for instance. The average draw weight that you have to hold at the top is about 60, maybe one or two of 70 pounds draw weight. You've got to hold it enough to take the measure of the target and then let go as quick as you can. But we were coming up with figures which made nonsense of that. We were coming up with figures which absolutely staggered us, and we thought, no, somewhere we've made a mistake. We were coming up with figures between 100 and 170 plus pounds draw weight. Imagine trying to hold for a long enough moment to aim 170 pounds. Thank God you use pounds and ounces as we do. Whenever I write about it nearer Europe, it has to be translated into meters and all those things, which I've never understood. But we thought, now what can we do? This is really defeating. We don't believe what we're discovering. So we leaked some of our figures surreptitiously, and the entire world of archery rose up as a man or a woman and said, these ginks are lying to us. They're talking absolute rubbish. So there was a great surge of hostility. And luckily we knew a professor in Amsterdam who was a great authority in physics. And he said, he knew these two professors who I was working with. He said, send me the vital statistics of bows, and I will tell you by return of post pretty nearly what the bows actually weighed in their heyday when they were babes. And so we did, and he came back with these extraordinary high figures which had so defeated us. So we had some bows made already which I'd ordered to be what I called approximations. They were sort of copies of the Mary Rose bows. Now I must talk to you briefly, take a brief pause here because I must talk to you about two ships. One of them is yours, or rather belongs to France, but it's in Texas. Do you know about it? Have you heard about the... Here I have to turn up documents because of my sad age. La Belle. In 1684, King Louis XIV of France sent explorer René Robert Cavelier de La Salle across the ocean with 4 ships and 400 people to North America. The explorer was to land at the mouth of the Mississippi River, establish a colony and trade routes. Here we go again. Same thing always now, isn't it? Which is one of the things that Obama said to us, by the way. He said, if you stay in Europe, you'll be okay. If you come out of Europe, it's this awful word Brexit. I hate it. He said, if you employ Brexit, you'll be at the back of the line, back of the queue. He honoured us by saying queue instead of line. But he told us that we would be at the back if we came out. And that we did take exception to that. Anyhow, the plan was never realized by this ship and the French captain. Instead, in a series of remarkable circumstances, La Salle lost ships to pirates and disasters of various kinds, sailed past his destination, and was murdered by his own men. He was sort of an unlucky guy, wasn't he? In 1686, La Belle, the one remaining expedition ship, wrecked in a storm, sank to the muddy bottom of Matagorda Bay. Do you know where that is? Where it rested undisturbed for over 300 years. In 1996, archaeologists located that ship in the process of excavating, recovering, and conserving what was left of the hull, along with more than 1.6 million artifacts. And the La Belle and her contents are now the center of attraction at the Texas Artifacts Museum. They tell the whole story of the French sailors and colonists, everything else, and make sure to see the brass cannon with lifting handles, shaped like dolphins. Well, I've passed that message on. And it's the center of the Texas Museum exhibition, so you must go and see that, whether you like it or not. But at the same time, no, not the same time, earlier, 1545, an English ship of war, who was the admiral of Henry VIII's navy, whose father, Henry VII, had commissioned it, and it was laid down in 1508 or 9, and first took to the sea the following year, and sank in action against the French. Who else? Not against you. Just off the south coast of England. And eventually, the wreck was discovered, and a whole enterprise was set in motion by the most extraordinary woman who ran the whole affair, called Margaret Rule. I don't know whether you read anything about her, but she was the sole spirit of the raising of the ship, which eventually came up in 1982. And in 1977, her desk at the headquarters of the enterprise was covered with books, technical books, about every sort of study she would have to go into. Tudor shipbuilding, Tudor rigging, everything, piles of books. And among the piles was my first book called Longbow, surprisingly. And she said, oh, wait a minute, I've got a book. when up from the depths came what the diver came into her office and showed her and said, I think it's a pikestaff. And she looked at it for a second and said, no, it isn't. That's our first longbow. Now, wait a minute, I've got a book. She unearthed mine from low down in the pile and said, this fellow, who is he, Hardy? We've got to get hold of him. I've dipped into this book. It's very good, very knowledgeable. We've got to get him. So I was got. And eventually, I was commissioned to take charge of the bows as they came up, because they came up thick and fast. That first bow was just short of 7 foot and very knobbly and covered with sea creatures, you know, nasty little creatures who'd eaten into it. But gradually, more and more, bows that looked as if they'd been made just the other day came up in boxes. And I was put in charge of the whole lot, 138 complete, and masses of bits and pieces, all of which were useful. And I was commissioned to look after them, deal with them, bring them back to life, and test them as far as was possible, to the point of, if necessary, destroying up to 3. In fact, we only destroyed 1 and slightly damaged 2 others, which I was able to repair. But that was my alternative life. And by God, it was hard work. It took years and years, but well worth it. I could stop acting altogether for a year, certainly, and forget about all the difficulties of that kind of life and its rewards, and deal with the history of the longbow, which I then started, of course, to write about, my own studies, furthering where I'd started. But the ship herself, when she came up, was on a day after the day that had been arranged for her to come up, and I'd been down there, like the Prince of Wales, he was down there, and a host of other people, thousands upon thousands in little boats, watching for this hulk to surface and be restored to the world. And it was cancelled for the Sunday, it was supposedly the day of the raising, and put off to the Monday. And I thought I really must do some rehearsing on this film that I'm in, where I'd been called to do rehearsing. So I dutifully went to London and rehearsed, and was having breakfast in the canteen when a fellow who knew me burst in and said, "Aren't you something to do with the Mary Rose?" And I said, "Yes, confess." He said, "They've just dropped her." And I said, "Dear God, what do you mean?" Rushed for a phone, luckily got straight through to the PR people, who said, "Cease to panic, we haven't dropped her. She just slid in her holding harness a tiny bit, but nothing has been broken. Come on down as quick as you can." So I abandoned rehearsal and went on down and actually saw her beginning to come in. I saw her fully surfaced and begin her journey back to Portsmouth, where she was built in 1508 and 9. Extraordinary. She was then berthed about 50 yards from the berth where she was actually constructed. It was as if she had to get back home. But now, where shall I go from there? I've got endless notes, you see, to guide me, but I seem unwilling to be guided. I think one of the things, to return to why I became an actor, it was never objected to in the family, but I think they did whisper behind closed doors, "Just leave him alone, he'll forget all about it." But I didn't, of course, And I think one of the things that finally cemented it, aged 5, possibly 6, was a family wedding. And I was supposed to hold one side of the very end of a very long train of my aunt who was being married. And at the other side was a girl of the same sort of age who rejoiced in the name of Teresa Coltman Rogers Coltman. So you can tell that it was quite a society wedding. And she had a nerve fit before we went into the church and refused to do anything. So my grandfather emerged from the church where he was going to give his daughter away and said, "Hold out your arms." So I held out my arms about that. And he said, "If you're careful and avoid the great sag in the middle, hold it really far out and look down at where your feet are going, I think you can do it alone." So I did it alone. And up the aisle we went, and every eye in a very full church was turned, first on the bride and bridegroom, I have to say, and then on me, doing my solo act. And I thought, this is what I'm after. This is what is worth having. Everyone's attention. So for the very worst reason, that cemented my determination. The worst reason because that's not the best reason for becoming an actor, because you want to be the center of attention all the time. But that did cement things a bit. Now the time is getting on, and you might have some questions. So I think the best thing for me to do is to stop right there and say, "Do you want to say anything back to me?" Like, "That was the most boring speech I've ever heard." Or, "Well tried," "Well failed," or anything else you'd like me to touch upon. Do please speak up. Yeah.
How long were you taught by C.S. Lewis?
By Tolkien I was taught too short a time, only the time when I was waiting to go and be taught by the Air Force. So it was about 9 months. And he was a miraculous teacher. And after the very first tutorial with 6 of us, he was a university tutor, so we were 6 to 1 against him. Whereas in my college with Lewis, we were either one-on-one or sometimes 2-on-1 with him, so we could take as long as we liked. But after the first tutorial with Tolkien at his college, he said, "Now next week, Thursday, we're going to the Bird and Baby." And we all looked inquiringly, and he said, "Oh, come on, that's the Oxford for the Eagle and Child. It's a pub. I will set you all up a pint of the best beer, and we will arrange ourselves as I dictate when we get there." When we got there, he put himself with his back to the window, table between us and him, and us 6 ranged around him. And then he covered his face and said, "I'm not going to look at you again until the end of the game. And when we get there, I've got a game to play with you. But for the moment, I promise not to look at you. All change your places. And I will just say, when you're set, tell me when you're ready. I will call 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I want each of you to speak for at least 2 minutes. And don't be, for God's sake, shy. That would bore me to extinction." Okay, right. I'm not seeing you, believe me. Number 1, speak for 2 minutes. And we each of us spoke, some timidly, some outright. And when he came to me, I forget which number I was, he said, interesting, interesting, very mixed. He'd already analysed 2 or 3 people, where they came from, what were the influences on their speech. And they confessed, each of them, at the end of his analysis, he was absolutely on the money with them. Came to me and he said, this is interesting, it's complicated. There's a certain sort of Welsh lilt in your voice, but unfortunately it's covered over with a rather posh London sort of grandeur. And then he went on and he said, am I right at all? And I said, yes. I was born and brought up on the Welsh border with a leg in England and a leg in Montgomeryshire. And as to London, yes, I know it pretty well. And posh, I'm afraid, is true. And he then went off and finished the others. And said, now I'll explain why I wanted us to play this little game. Because when I say to you that this is what Anglo-Saxon sounded like, and I gave you a bit earlier on, and this is what Chaucer should sound like, gave you a bit, I want you to believe me, because believe you me, I have studied this matter for the whole of my life, and I am totally and utterly correct. And we did believe him, and we believed him forever afterwards. So that was the game, and that was particularly a Tolkien-esque sort of thing to do. And we had great fun with him. Anybody else want to say anything?
Was there a particular actor or director that you really enjoyed working with?
Yes. And yes, and yes. And unfortunately, it started early on, and he was the greatest director I came across ever. And he gave his name to Rowan Guthrie, to the Guthrie Theatre up north of here a bit. And because he was so good and so encouraging and so utter delightful and so inventive in every possible way, that every other director I came across afterwards fell short of him. So if these other directors fell short of anything, in my estimation, they got the rough end of my tongue, which wasn't a good thing. But he was great. And of course, other directors who I've worked for, I've really enjoyed. The one who did the 8-month classic on Churchill, I loved. And my godson is sitting there, who also played with some of you last evening, played acting games. He acted with me in a film about the man who broke all the records on the salt flats at Utah. Sir Malcolm Campbell, I'm sorry to say, was English. And he played the son who broke all the water speed records and finally was killed on an English lake because he went so fast the boat came back on itself. You may have seen film of that. The actual happening, it's heartbreaking to see. But we played father and son. And my favourite scene in that, apart from all of it was fun, was when father had just got hold of his school report, which was really quite bad. And he called the boy in to dress him down. And we had a very good scene together about it, the awfulness of school reports. Any other thoughts? Because it is now short by 5 minutes of an hour, which is quite enough for you. It's certainly enough for me. Working in Shakespeare is the best thing in the world. I love it, absolutely love it. apart from anything else, it's so easy to learn the lines. They lodge and stick with you, although in a tutorial that I was in this morning and watched, brilliant tutorial. What's his name? Paul Ray. And he was doing a tutorial on my 3 favorite plays, Henry IV-1, Henry IV-2, Henry V, which are a wonderful triply. Magnificent 3 plays. He was quite brilliant. And he asked me, he said at one point, do you know the speech in Richard II by John of Gaunt about England? I said, of course I do. Every Englishman knows it. Would you please give it, he said. And I started off, I got through 2 lines and stopped. Absolutely bang, dried completely. So I don't remember everything. On account of age, you understand. It is true. Playing Shakespeare is magic. Of course, the actor's answer to what's the play of his that you've played that you enjoyed most, the actor's answer, if you've been lucky enough to play it, is very often Hamlet. It's one of the greatest plays ever written anywhere. And it's certainly my favourite. But very close to it comes Coriolanus, because Coriolanus is a redoubtable, rather bad character. I always felt I understood. So he comes quite close. But those 4 plays, Richard, Henry, are my best. And that's what... Now, I played Hamlet and Henry V at the Ravinia Festival by Chicago. And unfortunately, the theatre, which is very beautiful, is open at the sides, and just below the theatre runs an enormously busy railroad. So when it came to the end of Hamlet, when poor Hamlet is dying and should be allowed to say, the rest is silence. Ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. An enormous train used to come on night by night. So sometimes I used to have to say, the rest, and just hold it like that until the train came and went, because it was a stop. There was a getting off point of the train. And after everybody had forgotten which play they were watching, I would say, the rest is silence. And sometimes it got a hell of a laugh. Sometimes it didn't. Those are the nights that I enjoyed, because it meant that all that had gone before, 3 hours before, had worked for them. I don't know, almost any play of Shakespeare's is so worth doing. Not all of them, I do confess. I hate Love's Labour's Lost. Chiefly, I think, because the designer had made us all wear very stiff ruffs, which dug into our necks and we could hardly speak. Very famous designer, too. I could have killed him. That's an hour, folks. So you have every excuse to leave by the quickest door. But on the other hand, if there's anything else you want to say, pray, say it. Well, that was the easiest thing I've ever done. It required no acting at all. One just had to learn the lines, which, if in doubt, were written up for you and held like that. And it was packed full of actors and actresses I'd known for years and years and years, and we all behaved quite badly. So one director or other used to come roaring round from the scene of action, real film action, and say, for goodness sake, shut up! And we used to shut up a bit. But it was great fun. And the kids were so good. Really good, sensible kids, being superbly educated, with first-class tutors the whole time. The moment the director shouted, cut, off they toddled to a tutorial. And very bright boys they became, didn't they? It was fun, but not demanding at all. When I started doing it, I thought, this is it, I've retired. My first director on the first one that I came in on, Harry Potter 2, I guess it was directed by a lovely American called, what's the name of the great explorer? What? Speak up. Chris Columbus, that's right. He said, by the way, you can. Please play the Minister for Magic. By the way, my name's Christopher Columbus, and I said, I don't believe it. He said, just call me Chris. He was a nice man. And the best of all the directors we had was a Brazilian. Was he a Brazilian? Yeah. He was wonderful. And we were filming in Scotland in August, which, as anybody who knows Scotland knows, is asking for disaster. And it rained and rained and rained. And three of us were all staying in the same hotel. Three of the leads used to be put into three separate black Mercedes because we weren't legally allowed to travel together for safety's sake, insurance and all that. We used to arrive at this highland location, soaking wet. And there he was, trudging up and down the mountain, hardly for the mist and fog able to see us. And he used to say things like, I can't see you, my camera can't see you, it's best you get back in your nice cars, go back to your hotel and have a really good lunch. Please do. And we troop away looking like a funeral procession. And have usually a very good lunch. But we're on call till 5 o'clock, by which time we were incapable of even the simple demands of Harry Potter. Oh, that was lovely. I loved that. I loved being a vet. I couldn't believe my luck because I'm a countryman, a country bumpkin, you know. Lived my life with animals and I was asked to do it again, for real, in front of the cameras. It was sometimes quite difficult because the crews with their big lamps and cameras and all this and that would walk past a line of thoroughbreds behind them, asking to be kicked. And I, the countryman, used to go up and say, for goodness sake, don't do that again. One of you will get killed. And Christopher Timothy, who you remember played the young vet, I heard some screaming and yelling from a loose box on a farm. And he was alone in there with a thoroughbred, together with the thoroughbred's breeder and owner, who had been asked to liven the thoroughbred up a bit so that Christopher's character would be in danger. And by God, he was in danger. Because I ran down to where it was and saw Christopher's scalp, just his hair parting, a hind hoof of this thoroughbred who by now was really not enjoying the game, parting his hair, and I went straight to the director. I said to Christopher, come out of there. And I went straight to the director and said, are you mad? You've nearly killed your leading actor. Which was true. And then he said, no, don't worry, your turn's coming. You're going to have to be run away with by the same horse. And I said, no, I'm not. Because I knew enough about horses to know one fall can ruin you for a month. Maybe 6 months, maybe for life. And anyway, I refused. So I knew enough about horses to know it was perfect idiocy, so I didn't do it. But a stuntman did it, and had a very nasty time. He was dragged across a whole cobble yard, and quite badly hurt. I was dragged by cattle, but people were astonished when quite happily I stripped my sleeve or pulled my shirt off and put my hand right up the back end of a cow or a calf, or dealt with lambs being born. And I remember a moment when we'd been working all night at pulling lambs out, and the joke was that Siegfried was in a dinner jacket with a white stiff shirt and emerged covered in blood. Ha ha ha. Very funny. And we came out into the dawn light, and there was some newspaper people. And one of them came up to me and said, Mr. Hardy, I gather you've just delivered a lamb. I said, lamb? I think I've done 15. And he said, oh, have you? Well there. And was that the first lamb you ever delivered? And I said, no. He said, when have you ever delivered lambs? And I said, at home. He said, have you really, you've actually done it? And I said, yes. How old were you? And I said, honestly, I can't remember. 5, 6, something like that. He didn't believe me, but he got it in the papers. But it was fun. And all the horses, which is my particular joy, the horse. And Siegfried, of course, was an equine vet, so I was rightly placed. But there were some good horses and good breeders with us, warning us about this one or that one, you know. But we did okay. And it was fun. It was very, very hard work. And we worked through 2 of the worst winters that they ever had in that part of Yorkshire. But survived. I mean, at times we had to stop filming because we couldn't actually speak. Our mouths were frozen. But it was worth doing. I think it went on too long, and I kept saying so. And the more they said that, the more they said, stay, please. Which I suppose was good. And then it started being shown in America, of course, and was very well received. Thank goodness. This is a little particular cough medicine for Hillsdale. Okay? Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.